Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Horror Mine. My name is Vic Shy, and this is the Scare Score, where I break down horror movies and rate them on how scary I think they are. In this episode, I'll be going over the 2018 supernatural horror film, Hereditary. Yes, I know it's not an Asian horror film, but it's a really good one you don't want to miss. I'll be going over the events that take place throughout the film while breaking down the scares and rating them on how scary they are or attempt to be. Hereditary is not only an excellent horror film, but a really good drama that hits you right in the gut. But how scary is it? Sit back and relax and join me as we explore Hereditary and tally up the Scare Score. Our movie begins letting us know a 78-year-old woman named Ellen Taper-Leigh has just passed away from an illness. She died inside of her daughter Annie's home, who is our main character, excellently portrayed by Toni Collette. The next shot is of a treehouse, and the camera pans across a room as really ominous music plays in the background. A man's voice can be heard saying something that sounds muffled but echoey at the same time. We then see the miniature model of a house and get a cool transition of Annie's husband Steve waking up their son Peter for Ellen's funeral. The intro to this film immediately creates a sense of looming dread that is felt throughout the entire film. The music is unsettling, especially the sound of that mysterious voice. It's an excellent start that made me very optimistic for the rest of the film. Steve goes out to check on their young daughter Charlie, and Annie is sitting in the car waiting on everyone. Steve finds and scolds Charlie for spending the entire night in the treehouse. Charlie is an intriguing character. She is a very sweet girl, but as we'll come to see, also very odd. The next shot is a photo of the late Ellen Leigh at her funeral service. It's a very ominous shot that gives off massively unsettling vibes, both because it suddenly appears on screen and thanks to the background music composed by Colin Stetson. It also appears as if Ellen is very much alive and looking right at you. Annie speaks about her mother during the service, which is when I immediately realized that this film would resonate with me on a personal level. My own mother tragically passed away less than a year ago, and I found myself in the exact same spot as Annie. Having to speak about her during the funeral service was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, and I truly hope she is in a better place. This one's for you, Mom. Annie talks about how her mother was very secretive and barely knew her. She had private friends, private rituals, and private anxieties. This shot is very significant to the film, specifically because of what Annie says and her necklace. A necklace that is also being worn by Ellen herself. While Charlie looks at her grandmother, a man gives her a weird, creepy smile. As Annie speaks, we see Charlie drawing a creepy picture of her mom and clicking her tongue, something she does continuously throughout the film. I also think the previous picture in her book is very interesting and will definitely revisit that. Charlie observes a woman rubbing something onto Ellen's lips while eating a chocolate bar. Steve asks her if it has any nuts because she is extremely allergic to them. There is so much to unpack in this scene, as a lot of things make a lot more sense upon second viewing. While this scene isn't necessarily scary, it's extremely important to the plot, and the unsettling feeling of dread is very strong. They return home from the service and we meet the adorable family dog Rexy. Annie and Steve have a conversation while she works on her miniature display. She is preparing for an exhibit and seems very passionate about her work. She is currently working on her terminally ill mother in hospice, and her work seems to reflect her life. He then checks in on Peter to see how he is processing everything. Steve is clearly a supportive husband and loving father that seems to be the glue trying to hold the family together. Actor Gabriel Byrne plays this role very well. Annie checks in on Charlie, where they have a very interesting conversation. She tells Charlie that she was Grandma's favorite and that Grandma never let Annie feed her. Charlie says Grandma wanted her to be a boy, and Annie admits that she herself was a tomboy growing up. Charlie wonders who will take care of her now, even saying that she'll need someone to look after her when Annie dies. While this appears to be an innocent conversation between a grieving mother and her daughter, it has a much more sinister meaning behind it. The odd figures made by Charlie on her desk are also significant. Annie notices the word Satany or Satany written on the wall behind Charlie's bed. She then looks through her mom's belongings and sees a book titled Notes on Spiritualism. The book contains a note to Annie from Ellen that says, "My darling, dear beautiful Annie, forgive me all the things I could not tell you. Please don't hate me and try not to despair your losses. You will see in the end that they were worth it. Our sacrifice will pale next to the rewards. Love, Mommy." An extremely ominous and dark note, especially given the events that are soon to follow. She turns off the lights and sees her mother's image in the dark. She then looks at a miniature scene of Ellen trying to feed Charlie as a baby and turns it around. This was a simple yet great scare scene that gave me chills. Ellen standing there in the dark and silence was super creepy. We're possibly made to think that Annie is simply seeing things, but you can clearly see Ellen slightly moving, meaning her spirit is definitely there. The miniature visualization of what Annie just told Charlie gives an even darker and more disturbing context to what is truly going on. Instead of taking her quiz at school, Charlie is working on another figure. A pigeon kamikaze dives straight into the window, which startles everyone but Charlie, who stares at a pair of scissors. Peter is distracted during a class lecture and quickly identifies himself as a fellow man of culture. The professor's lecture and themes written on the board are very applicable to the entire story, something I'll revisit towards the end. One of his classmates also gives a great reason as to why my dad hasn't returned in 27 years.
Why?
Because
Charlie uses scissors to Sir Ellen paint the head of the fallen pigeon for her figurine. She then notices a strange woman staring at her across the street. Annie notices the door to her mother's room open, where we see a triangle on the floor. Steve locks the door to ease her mind and receives a call from the cemetery. Ellen's grave has been desecrated, which he hides from Annie. Annie lies about going to the movies and attends a circle meeting to determine who will take the One Ring into Mordor. Wrong meeting. She is actually attending a grief recovery meeting on dealing with the loss of a loved one. She's initially hesitant to open up and says she was forced to attend similar meetings a couple of years ago. We learn her father died when she was a baby and her schizophrenic brother passed at the age of 16. His resignation letter from life accused Ellen of putting people inside him. She completely opens up and feels that she is to blame for the tragedies in her life. Toni Collette gives an amazing and raw performance in this film. The way she portrays the grieving Annie feels genuine and authentic. Her performance is one of the best things about the film. While smoking and stalking his crush's Facebook profile, Peter gets invited to a party. He doesn't notice someone is right outside his window staring at him. Charlie is working on her figurine and a strange blue light quickly sweeps across the room. She walks outside and we get an interesting shot of her treehouse that clearly looks like there is some kind of symbol on it. The most obvious one appears to be the Nordic rune Elhaz, a rune that represents protection and the antlers of an elk. If you remove the vertical line along the middle, it almost appears like the square and compass symbol associated with Freemasonry. I noticed that the bark of the tree surrounding it sort of looked like eyes. Also, considering the triangle in Ellen's room and Charlie's triangular-shaped room, there is a lot of occult symbolism on display. Peter asks his mom if he can go to the party and she wants him to take his sister. Charlie then sees what appears to be her grandma sitting in a field of grass between fire, and he brings her back inside and forces Charlie to go with Peter, something neither of them really want. During the drive, he looks in the rearview mirror annoyed at his sister clicking her tongue in the back seat. They drive past a telephone pole marked with the same symbol as Annie and Ellen's necklaces. They arrive at the party that is playing some pretty hardcore music. Peter sets his sights on his crush named Bridget, and the mission is a go. We see Annie working on a miniature scene of her creepy old mother staring at her while she sleeps. Peter goes to smoke with his crush and distracts Charlie using some chocolate cake, a cake that contains lots and lots of these nuts. This goes down about as bad as you'd think, and then some. Charlie comes in wheezing harder than I do after any amount of exercise and feels like her throat is getting bigger. Instead of calling 911, he tries rushing her to the hospital himself from a house in the middle of nowhere. Peter is now freaking out, and keep in mind that he is also under the influence. His decision-making skills aren't the best right now, and neither are his driving skills. Charlie sticks her head out of the window for some air, and Peter swerves to avoid an elk in the middle of the road. Charlie eats a telephone pole to the face, which successfully gets her to stop wheezing. Peter is petrified by what just happened and can't get himself to look back at the damage. I bet those tongue clicks wouldn't sound as annoying right about now. He slowly drives away in the car that probably weighs about 5 pounds lighter. This scene was shocking. I knew something bad was going to happen because of her allergies, but I did not expect that to happen to Charlie. The horrified look on Peter's face, accompanied by complete silence, is absolutely gut-wrenching and horrifying. The murderous telephone pole is the same one they drove past earlier. I also believe the fact that Peter avoided an elk on the road is no accident, especially considering the L has rune shaped on the treehouse that symbolizes the elk. Peter comes home and goes straight to bed without saying a word of what happened. The next morning, Annie finds Charlie and Peter listens to her heartbreaking wails. We are then shown the gruesome aftermath, and Charlie's head is now an anthill. The image is brutal and shocking. The effect of Charlie's tragic death on the family is swift and heavy, especially because of its brutal nature and it happening right after Ellen's death. Annie is now sleeping in the treehouse treehouse, a place where Charlie would often sleep. Steve notices their empty bedroom and the word Zazas is seen written on the wall. He looks at Charlie's sketchbook and sees the head of a pigeon wearing a crown. The next pages are unfilled and he breaks down in tears. Peter is now traumatized and hallucinates looking into the rearview mirror that night. When hanging out with friends, he experiences a panic attack and feels like his throat is getting bigger. He comes home late and Annie can be seen watching him from inside the car. She goes to the grief recovery meeting but has second thoughts about going inside. She meets a woman named Joan who recently lost both her son and grandson. She gives Annie her info and lets her know that she's not alone. Annie lies to Steve about where she's been and goes back to sleep in the treehouse. She doesn't seem to rely on her husband for comfort during this difficult time. While trying to fall asleep, Peter hears Charlie clicking her tongue. I had a feeling the tongue click was going to be used that way, and it's very effective. Annie struggles to focus on her work, and Steve suggests asking the gallery for an extension. Being unable to focus on work while dealing with personal struggles is something I can definitely relate to. A bottle of blue paint falls over on its own, but Annie thinks that she knocked it over. This specific shade of blue is very prevalent throughout the film. The interior of the house, the strange blue light, the people at the party, the sticky notes, and there is even a bit of blue on the pigeon. Annie goes to Joan's house and notices the welcome mat is just like the ones her mother used to make. She describes discovering Charlie's body and pulls something weird out of her mouth. I'm still not quite sure what that is. She then recounts a disturbing incident where she was sleepwalking and almost took out her entire family with a box of matches. Peter has always held the incident against her and their relationship has never been the same. Steve walks in on Annie recreating the crash that took Charlie's life. He appears very frustrated with the way Annie is handling their loss, especially because she is distancing herself from the rest of the family. He makes dinner for everyone and it goes about as well as you'd expect. Peter asks his mom to say what's on her mind and she completely goes off on him. She obviously blames him for what happened and resents that he hasn't taken responsibility or apologized for Charlie's death. Steve sits there in silence watching it all unfold and the look on his face is heartbreaking. While it would be easy to blame Peter for his sister's death, he brings up an excellent point. Annie was the one who made Charlie attend the party.
She didn't want to go to the party.
There is a lot of finger pointing for something that was a tragic accident, though we will soon find out it was no accident at all. Steve tells them to stop right now and the look on Annie's face is both horrifying and tragic. She displays so much emotion in a matter of seconds. She goes from annoyed to enraged and almost completely breaks down into tears before walking off. Toni Collette's performance, especially during this scene, is nothing short of amazing. It is by far the best performance I have ever seen by anyone in a horror film. Both Gabriel Byrne and Alex Wolff also bring their A game and manage to express so much emotion without saying anything. While buying some art supplies, Annie runs into Joan in the parking lot. Joan says she attended an open seance held by a spiritual medium. A flyer for the seance was seen in Annie's mail slot earlier. Joan says she contacted her grandson and wants to show Annie herself. They go to her apartment where Joan contacts the spirit of her grandson Louis. She makes Louis move a glass cup to communicate and he moves Annie's hair. The spirit writes "I love you, Grandma" on a chalkboard and Annie is completely terrified. Annie wants to stop and Joan briefly appears offended. She then tries comforting Annie and gives her instructions on how to contact Charlie herself. It's very important that every family member is in the house when she tries this. The seance scene was a tame yet very effective scare scene. The presentation felt simple and Joan's intent almost innocent, but there is a very dark undertone to what's happening that is perfectly portrayed through Annie's reaction. Annie drives home in tears and suddenly hears Charlie's tongue click behind her. Charlie's tongue click is so terrifying mostly because of the psychological torment it creates on the family. Hearing that not only scares Annie but leaves her completely broken. That night, Annie notices several large ants crawling in her room. The same ants that lived in Charlie's head ran free after the accident. She follows the ants into Peter's room and finds his dead body covered in them. The look on her face perfectly reflects the disturbing sight. Peter wakes up and Annie realizes that she was sleepwalking. She then drops the bombshell that she never wanted to have Peter in the first place. It sounds like Ellen forced her into keeping him despite her numerous efforts not to. This leads me to believe that Peter was a not so accidental accident and that Steve may not be his biological father. They both break down in tears and appear drenched before going up in flames, and Annie finally wakes up from the disturbing nightmare. This is one of the better nightmares within a nightmare sequence I have seen. The atmosphere was very off-putting, and the visual of the ants on Peter's body was disgusting. Annie's reaction to the disturbing sights really enhances the scare factor. This scene also drops quite a bit of hints into Annie's dark past with her mother Helen, which has directly affected her relationship with Peter. She wakes Peter up and apologizes for what she said to him in her dreams. She also wakes up Steve and brings the two downstairs to try and contact Charlie's spirit. Annie seems very excited about the whole thing, and seeing the way she's trying to cope with her grief is very interesting. Steve is baffled by the entire thing, but agrees to participate when Peter says he wants to try.
What language is even that?
Daddy, chill.
What the hell is even that?
Okay, you can't tell me that quote from Steve wasn't inspired by that. Annie starts speaking directly to Charlie, and there is an immediate shift in the mood and atmosphere. Peter hears a creaking noise behind them and feels a change in the air before the glass cup suddenly moves. She tries getting Charlie to draw on the sketchbook, but Steve and Peter are freaked out by what's happening. Steve tells Annie to stop, but she frantically keeps trying. Peter has difficulty breathing before a glass cabinet shatters behind them. The ember turns into the moved flamethrower before Annie emits a strange raspy croaking sound.
Hello?
Mom?
Mom?
Annie is now seemingly possessed by Charlie's spirit, who is just as confused and scared as everyone else. Things get pretty chaotic before Steve turns on the light and splashes Annie with water, putting an end to the seance. Peter breaks down in tears, and Annie doesn't recall what just happened. This seance scene was totally spooky and chaotic. Annie's enthusiasm before things go wrong is really sad to see. What Annie just did quickly ramped up the level of supernatural activity and scare factor. The moment Annie started croaking is when I knew things just got serious. Charlie speaking through Annie caught me off guard and was also really off-putting. We get an eerie shot of Annie's miniature models that have been very creepy from the beginning. The words Liftoge and Pandemonium are seen written on the wall, and if you thought Peter couldn't be any more traumatized, he's definitely more traumatized. During class, he sees the strange blue light quickly sweep across the room. He sees his own reflection smiling at him in an empty sort of way before hearing Charlie's tongue click. The scariness in this scene comes from the fact that it's happening in broad daylight in a crowded classroom. The evil energy is now attached to Peter, and it doesn't care if he needs to focus for his test tomorrow, hence this very Kevin James-esque smile. Steve calls Annie and says Peter believes an evil spirit is threatening his life. She then gets a voicemail from the gallery director Patrick, who is actually voiced by the film's brilliant director, Ari Aster.
Annie, hi, this is Patrick at the Archer Gallery.
This is Ari Aster's first feature-length film, and he does an amazing job directing. Annie then becomes enraged and starts Hulk smashing her work. Steve comes home to Annie's completely destroyed work and sees the head of miniature Peter missing. He decides that Annie just hit a level of crazy enough to make him sleep on the couch. He then takes more than his fair share of pills to help him fall asleep. Upstairs, Annie hears pencil drawing on paper coming from Charlie's room. As she gets closer, the sound gets louder and feels very unnerving. She goes inside and sees the sketchbook and pencil drawing on their own. What makes this scare scene great is the sound design combined with excellent storytelling. The moment I heard pencil hitting paper, I knew exactly what was happening and got chills. By the look on her face, Annie also knew exactly what it was and walked over with a very contained reaction to what she was seeing. At this point, she'll embrace any and all signs that Charlie is still here. Peter is woken up by the tongue click and sees Charlie's spirit standing in the dark. Her head then rolls off her body and turns into a ball, which was a very unnerving yet cool visual. Rexy growls and a pair of hands suddenly grab Peter's face. The hands aggressively pull on his head as the door slams shut and Rexy is heard whimpering. A brief but effective scare scene that feels like an enhanced version of the similar one earlier. It turns out that Annie was the one pulling on Peter's head but claims that she wasn't aware of her actions. Annie realizes that something terribly wrong is happening to her family and she must stop it. The pages of the sketchbook move on their own and reveal several disturbing drawings of Peter in distress. Annie throws the sketchbook in the fireplace, but her arm also catches on fire. She realizes she won't be able to burn the book without taking herself out. The next day, Annie creepily stares at Peter from the darkness of her room. She goes back to Joan's apartment, but she isn't there. Inside the apartment, we see several things that are pretty concerning. There are several lit candles and Peter's photo on a table surrounded by a triangle. We also see the same strange symbol from earlier, as well as one of Charlie's figures, showing that Joan isn't the nice old lady she made herself out to be. Joan shows up to Peter's Peter's school and yells out, "I expel you," and "get out," along with several words in another language. This has a strange effect on Peter, and the dark truth of what's happening will soon be revealed. Annie goes back through her mother's things and confirms that Joan's doormat was made by Ellen. We see a passage in one of the books about King Payman, the god of mischief. When successfully invoked, King Payman will possess the most vulnerable host. Only when the ritual is complete will King Payman be locked into the ordained host. Once locked in, a new ritual is required to unlock the possession. King Payman is a male, thus covetous of a human male body. We then see an album that contains several photos of Ellen and Joan, revealing that they knew each other this whole time. My interpretation of the film and the events may not be totally accurate, but here is what I believe has been happening. Ellen and Joan are part of a cult that worship King Payman and have been trying to find a perfect host for him to possess. The strange symbol on Annie and Ellen's necklaces and seen throughout the film is the symbol of King Payman and his cult. Most of the funeral attendees were most likely fellow members of the cult. Like Annie said during the funeral, Ellen had secret friends and secret rituals. She just didn't know how accurate that statement truly was. Ellen has been part of this cult for decades and has been molding Annie and her family to meet the needs of the cult. Ellen and the cult most likely had something to do with Annie getting pregnant with Peter. Annie never wanted Peter, but Ellen made her keep him to become a possible host for Payman. Ellen also wanted Charlie to be a boy, something she mentions in the beginning of the film. Everything that has happened to Annie in her life has been controlled by her mother. This is foreshadowed in the class lecture and themes written on the board. Just like Heracles in the Oracle, Annie never had a choice in life as everything was being controlled by Ellen. She could not escape her fate, and everything that has happened has been hereditary. Annie, while having no knowledge of her mother's true identity and intentions, is forced to bear the responsibility of continuing her work. Ellen even tried to do this with her own husband and son, as mentioned by Annie during the meeting. Her brother said Ellen was trying to put people inside him, which happened to be the dark truth. Joan has been discreetly influencing Annie and furthering the cult's plot. She made Annie try and contact Charlie, which actually strengthened King Paymon's grasp on the family. When she was yelling at Peter, she was actually trying to expel his spirit from his body for King Payman. All the terrible events that have taken place throughout the film, to include Charlie's death, have all been part of a larger plan to appease and bring King Payman to life. Steve is the most normal of the family because he hasn't been directly influenced by Ellen or the cult. I'm sure there are plenty of other meanings or interpretations that I'm missing, but that's pretty much the gist of it. It's a very dark and unsettling revelation that makes subsequent viewings of this film even better. Steve emails a psychiatrist about Annie's recent troubling behavior. He receives photos of Ellen's gravesite, which shows her grave dug up and her body missing. Annie goes searching for more answers in the attic and notices a ton of flies coming from there. She discovers her mother's headless body and the symbol of King Payman on the wall written in blood. Steve mentioned something about the horrible smell as he walked past earlier. A single fly could also be seen in the opening shot of the movie, possibly foreshadowing this moment. During class, Peter hears Charlie's tongue clicking multiple times before something takes complete control of his body. He gets a complimentary but painful nose job from his own desk as his teacher and classmates watch in complete shock. Steve drives Peter home and completely breaks down in tears at what's been happening to him and his family. He brings Peter home and Annie tells him about the body in the attic. She begs him to go check and he looks totally fed up with her. We hear him screaming upstairs, which confirms that Annie isn't just making it up. She tries explaining what's going on, but he thinks that she is responsible for everything. In order to save Peter, she begs Steve to burn the sketchbook, knowing it will also take her life. She pours lighter fluid on it, but Steve refuses to go along with her. She throws the sketchbook into the fireplace herself, and Steve goes up in flames. The blue light then sweeps across the room, and Annie becomes possessed. The color blue and the blue light possibly symbolize King Payman's power and influence over the family. Considering the walls inside the house are blue, they have been trapped by Payman from the very beginning. Peter wakes up in pain and sees light coming from inside the treehouse. He sits up, and Annie is hiding in the dark corner of the room just above him. I did not notice her here my first time watching. I just now noticed her while working on this video, and she really caught me off guard. Those are my favorite kind of scares. The silence in this scene really builds the tension and makes everything creepier. A loud noise is heard from somewhere else inside the house, as we also hear the buzzing sound of the flies. He finds his father's body downstairs, and Annie can be seen directly behind him. He notices a naked man behind him smiling at him, the same man who was smiling at Charlie during the funeral, before Annie suddenly appears and starts to chase him. He retreats into the attic as possessed Annie repeatedly bangs her head on the door. Annie banging her head is scary but also kinda hilarious, so I can't give it too much points. Everything else involving Peter and his possessed mother has been absolutely terrifying. The attic is lit up with numerous candles, and the spot where Ellen's body was has a picture of him with no eyes. We hear a weird squelching sound, and Peter looks up to a disturbing and shocking sight. Annie is floating in the air holding a piano wire, and I think any horror movie fan can use their imagination as to what she's doing with it. 3 more naked people appear, and Peter decides that this is an orgy he wants absolutely no part of. He screams before aiming right for the bushes, and we hear the horrifying result of Annie's piano wire usage. I thought that Charlie's death was shocking and disturbing, but I think that Annie's death tops it. I knew that Annie wasn't going to make it, but I was not expecting that. I also think that having us hear the aftermath as opposed to actually seeing it makes it so much more effective. Let's not forget to mention that Toni Collette went from being the sympathetic main character to utterly terrifying and crazy. The strange light hovers over Peter, then goes inside his body. He looks up and sees his mother's headless body floating into the treehouse. He clicks his tongue, showing that his body is now possessed by Charlie's soul. As he walks towards the treehouse, we see poor Rexy laying in the grass as well as several nude cult members. He climbs inside and sees a statue of King Payman with Charlie's head, which is a straight up disturbing sight to see. The statue looks very similar to the figures Charlie made. All the cult members are bowing to Payman, including the bodies of Annie and Ellen. We see a picture of Ellen titled Queen Lay, showing she is the leader of King Payman's cult. They place the crown on Peter's head, and Joan addresses him as Charlie. She reveals that Charlie is King Payman in Peter's body, one of the 8 kings of hell. They have rejected Payman's first female body, that being Charlie, meaning that Charlie was actually born as Payman. This explains why she was Ellen's favorite and why Ellen insisted on feeding Charlie instead of Annie. Taking a look at the last theme on the chalkboard, no man considered fortunate until he is dead, something the cult may find applicable to Charlie and Peter, as they have had the fortunate honor to bring Payman back to life after their deaths. The cult has bound and dedicated themselves to worshipping King Payman and ask for honor and wealth in return for their devotion. In the film's final scene, King Payman stands there with a look of total shock and confusion as the cult chants "Hail King Payman" as the movie ends. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Hereditary. My friends, I heard a lot of hype and great things about this film before coming in, but kept my expectations very reserved. I also went in completely blind, which made for the best viewing experience possible. I am happy to say that I absolutely loved Hereditary, and it exceeded my expectations. Despite the sensitive subject matter hitting close to home, I did not expect to be so emotionally invested in the film's story and its characters. There was just about everything that I look for in a great horror film: an engaging story, relatable characters, shocking twists and turns, and truly horrifying and well-crafted scares that stick with you long after the credits roll. The performances all across the board were fantastic, but Toni Collette as Annie definitely has the best and most memorable performance. The amount of range and raw emotion she portrays throughout the film was mesmerizing to watch. It truly is the best performance I've ever seen in a horror film, and one of the best performances I've seen in general, and I don't just watch horror movies. But let's talk about the real reason we're all here. Is Hereditary scary? The film is not only really scary, but also very shocking and disturbing. There is such a wide variety of horror greatness on display. There are quiet, well-crafted subtle scares, scare devices that rely on the story to be effective, such as Charlie's tongue click and sketchbook, as well as straight-up insanely disturbing imagery and brutality, all combined for a totally fun package that I wasn't expecting but absolutely loved, earning Hereditary a great scare score of 80%. This film isn't for everybody, but I really feel that it's one that definitely deserves to be seen, especially because of the clear care and dedication that went into making this excellent horror film. The scariest scene in the film is when Peter Peter wanders the dark house while being stalked by possessed Annie. My favorite kind of scares are the quiet, subtle ones that sometimes take a second viewing to notice something. I didn't notice Annie in the dark corner of the room the first time, and it really caught me off guard when I did. The way she silently crawls out of the room was really unnerving and gave me chills. A really well-crafted scare scene in a movie full of them. But, as always, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thank you all for tuning in, and I cannot wait to see y'all right back here in the horror mine. Y'all stick around.